Good morning. My name is Melissa Golding, and I'm the press officer for the Group of 30. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar launch of the final report of the G30 Working Group on Sovereign Debt and COVID-19. We look forward to engaging with you on this important topic. To join the discussion online, please follow the G30 on Twitter @Group of 30 and use the hashtag G30 Sovereign Debt. The working group released a preliminary report of its work in October 2020. The report being launched today, Sovereign Debt and Financing for Recovery After the COVID-19 Shock, Next Steps to Build a Better Architecture, presents the working group's final conclusions. We will begin the webinar with opening remarks from the co-chairs of the Group of 30 Working Group on Sovereign Debt and COVID-19, Dr. Lawrence H. Summers and Dr. Guillermo Ortiz. Following these opening remarks, we will take audience questions. Please note that everyone will be speaking today on behalf of the Group of 30's Steering Committee and Working Group on Sovereign Debt and COVID-19. They are here to discuss the results of the G30 study and to answer questions about the final report. They are participating in this webinar in their personal capacities, and their participation does not imply the support of their respective public and private institutions. We will begin a roundtable Q&A discussion immediately following the formal remarks. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Lawrence H. Summers, co-chair of the G30 Working Group on Sovereign Debt and COVID-19. Dr. Summers?
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you very much to the whole G30 apparatus, which did a tremendous job in supporting the working group and supporting Guillermo and I as co-chairs. Thank you also to Anna Gelpern, who did a superb job as the project director, to Brad Setzer, who's now in the US government, but played an important role in this project at an early stage, to Joe Gagnon, who carried on for Brad in the final stages, and the indefatigable Alex Nye, who served as research assistant. And I have to say, I'm very grateful to my co-chair, Guillermo. Anything that's right, rigorous, and logical in this report as it stands is a credit to him. Anything that's wrong is a reflection of the fact that I wouldn't compromise with him. We have a chance now to review matters with respect to sovereign debt and financing for recovery some distance into the crisis, in contrast to the preliminary report that we issued last fall. There have now been 3 sets of annual finance meetings since this took place, since the events began, and more than a year of experience. And it's a mixed picture. In the good news side, I think one needs to acknowledge that relative to what I expected, and I think most observers expected a year ago, or even expected 6 months ago, the international financial architecture for dealing with debt has stood up better than one might have expected. There have been fewer defaults. There have been fewer incipient defaults, probably fewer problems associated with debt overhangs that are expected than most would have believed, most would have anticipated. That is a reflection of the staggering levels of stimulus that have been provided within the industrial countries. That is a reflection of the extraordinary monetary policies pursued, particularly in the United States, that have led to a general increase in appetites for risk, that have led to the maintenance of flows of credit to emerging markets to an extent greater than I think we would have expected. We are not serene that this is a situation that is going to continue. We are not serene because of the biology in the near term. The risk of COVID mutation in particular appears substantially greater than would have seemed likely 6 months ago. The extent of the cleavage between the affluent countries and low and middle income countries in their capacity to complete a vaccination process and limit spread appears a more serious risk than it did at that time. We are also concerned about the medium-term macro environment could well discourage capital inflows and encourage capital outflows in a significant number of lower and middle income countries, reflecting particularly the risks that I and many others have talked about in other fora, that there's going to be a resurgence of inflation and an increase in interest rates in at least some advanced economies. Finally, we are concerned about the fact that while forecasts in the United States, Europe, and Japan suggest less scarring in the form of lower potential growth than looked likely 6 months or a year ago, if anything, the concerns seem to us greater in the developing world that there will be persistent lags in growth. This illustrates the point, drawing on the most recent IMF set of forecasts. It is clear that the cumulative gross GDP loss for the next 4 years is of a different order than in the United States in much of the emerging world. Perhaps the most striking bar is the one reflecting emerging and developing Asia ex Canada. I have the suspicion that the better performance of Africa relative to emerging Asia and Latin America is more a reflection of the fact that somewhat slower growth was already projected for Africa, and that there is some failure of discovery still of the gravity of the problem than I do serenity about how the situation will be managed in Africa. Perhaps not surprisingly, given this, we are encountering rising debt levels at the same time that limits in the level of expected growth, the possibility of higher interest rates and more constrained financial conditions, and changes in the risk appetite of potential creditors and the attractiveness of opportunities in emerging markets raise real questions, both for emerging markets as an aggregate and for the developing and for, in particular, for low-income developing countries. And here is what we fear historians will look back at. The capacity of selected advanced economies to mount a response relative to their size of GDP has been 4.5 times as large as the response of emerging markets, and the institutions that exist in many ways to take responsibility for what used to be called north-south capital flows have represented only a negligible level of support relative to the support that industrial countries have been able to provide themselves. Our fear is that in this environment, we are not well prepared to deal with what will come, either in terms of the maintenance of robust capital flows or in terms of our ability to deal with what quite likely will be quite serious debt problems going forward as this plays out. Let me turn to my co-chair, Guillermo, to take us further.
Thank you, Larry. Let me first join you in thanking Anna, Brad, and Joe for their very valuable contributions to this report, and Alex for his very able research assistance. Before going into the recommendations of this report and reviewing some of the ones that we put out in October, let me just complement what Larry just mentioned. It's quite remarkable that more than a year, almost a year and a half after the pandemic broke out, global contagion is at an all-time high, largely on account of what's happening in India, neighboring countries around India, and in Latin America, particularly South America, where health systems and hospital capacity have been really overwhelmed. With less than 1/10 of global population, Latin America has accounted for more than 1/4 of total COVID deaths. In Latin America, contraction last year was 7%, a bit over 7%. That's twice as much as the average global decline. And recovery prospects are weaker compared to other regions, and the longer-term consequences are dire. So emerging and frontier economies face the prospect of long-lasting damage, not least from the uneven pace of vaccination. The wealthiest 27 countries account for almost 40% of global vaccinations, while they represent 10% of world's population. As you can see in this graph, the risk of permanent damage is high, with more entrenched inequality among and within countries, years of lost growth, more poverty, and social strife. Lockdowns at home and abroad have hit hardest in countries with younger and more low-skilled workers, countries with poor digital infrastructure, where remote learning and so on is not possible, and those that also rely on tourism. Children in low-income countries miss nearly 5 times more school days than children in advanced countries. On the income distribution side, the IMF estimates that all the gains in terms of income distribution of emerging markets since the Great Crisis will be erased. Average Gini coefficient, in other words, will rise to 2008 levels. And according to the World Bank, the pandemic has pushed an estimated 100 million people into extreme poverty. Over the long term, risks include a rise in protectionism, geopolitical tensions, and higher probability, as Larry mentioned, of financial crisis in years to come, as countries struggle with higher debt and other legacies. Heavy borrowing, as the graphs that Larry showed before, has reduced the fiscal space to tackle structural issues such as poverty, inequality, inadequate infrastructure, and health systems. The preliminary report of the G30 working group called for a new funding of an unprecedented scale, given the magnitude of the shock. The need is more acute now. Yet, I think it's fair to say, and I think that Larry would agree with me, that the international response to date has been both inadequate and insufficient. For example, the IMF has identified the pandemic recovery finance needs from now until 2025 of around $450 billion just for low-income countries. And only a fraction of that has been available or is visible to date. In some regions, an entire generation could be trapped in a future of stalled growth, rising poverty, and scant development opportunities. For G20 governments, the next IDA replenishment is an important opportunity to signal strong commitment for recovery and development finance. I mean, IDA donors have agreed to bring forward 1 year replenishment, but obviously a much larger scale and more borrowing is needed. In relation to the IMF, mobilizing additional lending capacity will be very important in the coming years. A dedicated pandemic support window with longer repayment periods and aimed at implementing targeted structural reforms related to pandemic could deploy non-concessional resources, which only a fraction has been used today. I think that the firepower in terms of non-concessional resources of the funds is around 1 trillion, and only about 10–12% has been deployed. Following the decision of IMF shareholders to pursue an SDR allocation of 650 billion, an agreement to pool and recycle SDR liquidity where it's most needed, as we recommended in the preliminary report, would contribute significantly to boost global liquidity and finance recovery. So these are the first two recommendations of the working group. Mobilizing resources to boost concessional surge capacity for multilateral development banks, and deploy international liquidity and lending capacity from the IMF. Recommendations 3 to 8 address crisis planning, building a better architecture to deal with coming debt problems and future shocks. The aim is to strengthen the common framework for debt treatment beyond DSSI, which has been, I think, largely disappointing. So the framework is an institutional experiment to coordinate new and diverse creditors, a central challenge for sovereign debt restructuring today. I'm not going to go into details of the recommendation. Let me just summarize. The third recommendation is to expand the eligibility of the common framework to all vulnerable and low middle income countries. So it doesn't make sense to limit eligibility to what the universe is today, since it limits potential benefits to distressed countries. Recommendations 4 and 5 seek to ensure that compatibility applies to all material creditors. Now, given the serious coordination challenges, Paris Club members and common framework creditors should jointly revisit the content and application of compatibility to minimize the incentives to hold out. A standing consultative mechanism with representation of key stakeholders should be established to ensure, as we point out there, consistency across common framework debt treatments. 6.7 refer to bilateral debt contracts that interfere with multilateral debt relief initiatives, which should be rejected. I think this is very important. The G20 should state clearly that special repayment arrangements, collateral and other features that impede compatibility undertakings contravene international norms. In addition, national law should shield payments from creditors blocking payments to other creditors. This is something that Anna has been pushing very strongly about. And finally, the working group's preliminary report recommended including debt disclosure requirements as a barrier to enforcement of hidden debts. You know, it's pretty obvious that private sector official and multilateral lenders should encourage sovereign borrowers to adopt much more robust domestic debt disclosure, which today it's pretty muddy and it's really certainly not subject to any sort of standards. They should, again, disclose requirements as part of their authorization, debt authorization frameworks. Hidden debt does economic and political damage to the borrowing country and fuels mistrust among creditors. Let me conclude by saying that the G20 Common Framework remains a work in progress. Chad, Ethiopia, and Zambia have applied. Chad has started negotiations with an official bilateral creditor committee comprising members of the Paris Club and others. But the engagement today is, I think, too vague to shape a new regime. New creditors, new kinds of debts compound the already complicated problems of debt coordination. So we have a universe of official creditors, commercial banks, asset manager, hybrid financial institutions, non-financial firms from China and other regions, which most agree in loss distribution with incomplete information and little guidance. As we said in our first report, there is no silver bullets for sovereign debt problems. However, it's essential to reform the institutional framework in which increasingly diverse debtors and creditors make decisions about borrowing, lending, and debt restructuring. Let me end up here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ortiz. We will now begin the Q&A roundtable discussion portion of the webinar. Joining Dr. Summers and Dr. Ortiz for the Q&A discussion is the report's project director, Professor Anna Gelpern. Please use the Q&A box visible underneath your Zoom media player window to submit questions. We have a question from the Q&A box directed to Professor Summers, but we invite any of you to answer. The question is, how can Africa script a better narrative as a premium growth destination post-COVID?
It's a very good question that I think goes beyond the scope of our report and probably goes beyond the scope of my expertise. I would make these points. First, success in implementing the recommendations of this report will accelerate Africa's passage through the COVID trial. It will increase the capacity of Africa to invest in its future by raising the quantity of official finance that is available to Africa and increasing the confidence of creditors as they consider whether to roll over debts that are outstanding, and will permit the debt overhangs that are almost certain to arise in at least some African countries to be rolled over more effectively than would otherwise be the case. I think beyond that, countries that want to succeed in the global economy are increasingly going to need to develop a clear and strong sense of what their unique expertise is. That part of the new world where technology is permitting greater division of labor than used to be the case is that strategy is less and less about compensating for weakness and more about building on strength. And countries that want to succeed will need to identify their strength and to build on that strength.
Thank you very much, Dr. Summers. We have another question. This one I'll read aloud from the live audience. Debt levels and ratios for all economic units, government, corporate, and consumers, will be immense when we get out of the pandemic crisis. What is the view of the working group regarding debt write-off programs for obligations that were created during the crisis? For example, the SMEs that were forced to close during lockdowns.
Perhaps I will start. Let me say that in answering questions beyond those that look to clarification of the report, I'm going to speak for myself and not claim to be speaking for the working group as a whole. I think it is important in looking at debt burdens to look at both debt levels and to look at debt service levels. And in the current era of low interest rates, debt service levels are much lower in relation to debt levels than has been traditionally the case. And so not all of the alarm is warranted in every context. In general, I think that in the short run, the attractiveness of debt write-off programs is greater than it is in the medium and long run. In the short run, in response to a totally unexpected event, it is perhaps possible to write off various debts without creating an important precedent, except for similar kinds of remarkable shocks. Medium-term and continuing debt reduction programs create the inevitable expectation that today's new loan is tomorrow's stale and problematic loan, and can discourage the the flow of new credit. So I am sympathetic to things that were done in many places with respect to the writing off of debt, but think that debt write-off always has to be considered with a view to the impact on possible credit in the future. One of the points that has become clear to me, and I think to other members of the working group, is that at the sovereign level, there is probably an excessive issue right now that those who require their debts to be rescheduled or restructured, and who in fact would be more creditworthy for new borrowing, are averse to requesting that debt restructuring because they are scared that they will be downgraded, and that when they are downgraded, they will find it less easy to borrow in the future. And that's an issue that we, particularly in our first report, identified as a potentially problematic area. It's an area that requires appropriate attention between the rating agencies and particularly private sector institutions, but that we don't feel is in hand. That the excessive fear of discouraging new credit can, while a valid consideration, can be a quite serious problem with respect to the bringing about necessary debt restructurings. It may be that Guillermo or Anna wants to add something to that answer.
Yeah, let me, well, first of all, I'm not speaking for the G30 working group. These are my own opinions. But so something, let me focus on Latin America here for a moment. Something that has surprised me, given the extent of the shock and the extent of the contraction in economic activity and so on, is that banking systems in the region have not been strained more. Obviously, banking systems increase the level of reserves, and they have been doing some write-offs. But the strength of the balance sheets in general, I'm speaking in general, obviously, some banks in some countries have more weaknesses, but I would have expected a more systemic, let's say, consequence on the banking system due to the magnitude of this shock. Many banks in Latin America are actually liberating reserves that they created at the outset of the pandemic. So for all the scaring and the closing of hundreds of business and small and medium-sized enterprises and so on, this has apparently not created unsurmountable problems for the banking system. And also, I'm speaking also for other lenders who are not part of the formal banking system. So I was fearing at the outset that we would be compounding this crisis with a banking crisis, with the financial crisis, a local banking crisis, and this is not happening. I basically on the conceptual issue of rights off and so on, and the role of rating agencies in preventing, let's say, sovereign borrowings, particularly in low-income countries, from seeking debt rescheduling. I don't have anything to add to what Larry mentioned. I totally in agreement. I don't know, Anna, if you want to add something on this.
Well, just on the rating agency front, I think it may be valuable to just draw folks' attention to the discussion in this report. It's not framed as a recommendation, but we highlight the fact that the way in which the information is presented is remarkably tilted against countries that may wish to address debt overhang or liquidity problems. Right? So when a report comes out that has potential for comparability in the first paragraph and a war in the 8th paragraph, with no historical information on kind of the context for downgrades and upgrades, it creates a narrative, to borrow from one of the questions. And I think that's where there's room for change. And frankly, it's not, it doesn't have to be terribly dirigiste. It's rethinking the presentation, how information is used.
Next, I have a question from Concha Artola, Senior Economist at Banca de España. This is directed at Dr. Ortiz. They are wondering if he could please elaborate on the statements he's made during the webinar regarding the failure of DSSI.
Well, perhaps I put it in harsh words, talking about failure. I mean, relative to what was expected when DSSI was launched, the number of countries which have participated were much less than what was expected at the beginning, because DSSI, remember, was just a form of postponing payments and offer temporarily relief in terms of postponing debt payments. The other part that has to do with the issue of rating agencies that Anna just mentioned is that several countries that were eligible for DSSI did not want to participate because they feared that they would be downgraded. Apparently, when countries applied for debt relief, they were automatically downgraded. And there was no mention of how to get out of this sort of black hole of downgrades and so on. So in that sense, the expected results from DSSI were not met. Debt relief came to about less than 1/2, if I recall, Anna, of what was expected, and this has also to do with the fact that it was up to the countries, to seek assistance, to always on a case-by-case basis, but with the threat of being downgraded and with the stigma associated with seeking debt relief. So the whole concept led itself to a natural reluctance of countries to embark on this, because in exchange for just deferring payments, you were risking, a bad name in terms of downgrades and so on, and future lack of access to credit markets. I don't know, Anna, if you want to complement this.
Sure, and even so, there was downgrade watch, and there was just a lot of reinforcement of a really problematic narrative that I think the international community is trying to undo as we progress in this experience. Right? So some of it may have been setting false expectations, some of it may have been a communication issue, but there were very high expectations. The delivery was late and low. And in the process, the idea that seeking a debt postponement and reaching out to private creditors was a reputational problem, instead of getting diffused, got reinforced. And I think that's something that creates some baggage for the common framework. I think some of these problems have been, worked over time, but I think that the legacy of DSSI is mixed.
Thanks very much. We have a question from Ali Raza Mehdi at the State Bank of Pakistan. They're asking, what role can advanced economies central banks play in facilitating the adoption of common framework for low-income countries in terms of coordinating the response from economic agents under their national jurisdictions?
You want to take that, Larry?
I'm sure that I think that will vary from country to country. In general, I think it is one of pushing, prodding, perhaps occasionally shaming, rather than something where there's legal authority that can be exercised vis-a-vis private sector actors. I think in many countries, the central bank would have enormous influence on the way the sovereign carried out international financial relations. And so a central bank that was very firm on the proposition that, for example, secret debt ought not to be entered into, or norms ought to be, international norms ought to be respected, could have substantial influence. And we will certainly, through the G30, be seeking to socialize this report with the central banking community.
I think that central banks in advanced countries, through their extraordinary monetary policy actions, as Larry mentioned at the outset, not only prevented the worst case scenario that was envisaged last year, but it's also, let's say, reducing the debt burden in terms of debt payments and debt service of emerging markets. And central banks in emerging markets have also, particularly last year, they were able to ease monetary policy and reduce the economic consequence of the shock. This year, however, with the uptick in inflation, it's more than uptick. I mean, we have a real inflation problem coming from the disruptions in supply chains and so on, increasing commodity prices. We hope that this does not become an entrenched phenomenon. Personally, I think that this is unlikely to happen. But monetary policy in emerging markets being tightened now. So this is the main preoccupation of central banks. Questions of domestic financial instability and so on, and obviously the advisory role that they play in governments in terms of assessing the viability of debt burdens in the future. So, as Larry was saying, this is something case by case, but I think that central banks have a very important role to.
Thank you. Another question that's come in live. Given the diversity of creditors, how would you recommend the implementation of comparability, e.g., secured versus non-secured creditors, or providers of concessional loans and market loans?
Can I just say that in a second, I'm going to turn that question to Anna and say that one aspect of our experience with this report is that I think more than is customary in reports of this kind, while it was taking place, significant empirical research took place. Anna and a group of colleagues analyzed a range of Chinese debt contracts, sovereign debt contracts, and also had occasion to look at what were prevailing practices in the contracts of other countries. And I think found rather more in terms of provisions in which security was taken, in which commitments not to participate in restructuring processes were entered into, and in which other problematic practices were followed than the world might be widely aware of. On the one hand, I think it raised considerable concerns about developments in China. On the other, Anna's research, I think, suggested that it would be a serious mistake to suppose that some of these problematic practices were limited to Chinese contracts. So I salute her on what I think is as important research, genuine research as has taken place in this area in a long time. Let me turn this to her.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words for you and my co-authors. And this, I think, goes very much to the focus of the G30 report's recommendations on the common framework. Given this diversity of creditors, particularly the fact that China chose to join and take an active role in the common framework. This is an opportunity, perhaps the most important opportunity for several decades for serious institutional innovation and progress in sovereign debt restructuring architecture. And I think that the report's focus on bolstering and building on and really elaborating the common framework is conveys that view. Comparability is a wonky Paris Club word for equity, right? And equity and comparability doesn't mean everybody needs to do the identical thing. And I think that the report, and to a large extent, I think that the common framework material does a better job than, let's say, DSSI, where there was a commitment to net present value neutrality and other specifics. Comparability and equity are broad concepts, right? It really means that you have to work out what is appropriate for each creditor category and each kind of instrument. And that is why the G30 report proposes this secretariat function, a standing mechanism that would hold a thread through a series of case-by-case restructurings, that is the common framework, and introduce some consistency, transparency, and equity so that we can learn from one case to the next, and that there is public accountability, so nobody's wondering what's going on behind closed doors and who's getting the better deal or not. The question is exactly right. Secured debt is a really tough challenge. Formal and informal collateral arrangements are a problem. Transparency is a big solution to that, but it's going to be a long slog, which is why we need, again, a structure that creates some continuity from case to case so that hopefully we can build a better architecture.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Lorenzo Bini Smahi. He's chairman of Societe Generale. He said, is the working group suggesting less developed countries, in particular Africans, treat bilateral debt contracted with China in different forms as junior with respect to multilateral debt? What about debt with market participants? How can these countries achieve that without retaliation?
Lorenzo, it's good to hear from you. The answer to your question is a firm and resolute no. What the working group is insisting on is that the debt not be treated as de facto senior because of artifice in the provisions that are inserted or failures of the restructuring process. The word, the much repeated word and principle comparability, which is much easier to state than to make precise, and easier to make precise than to implement, is exactly directed at avoiding de facto juniority or seniority with respect to any class of creditors. We are convinced that there are legitimate concerns about the de facto senior character of certain kinds of debt. And while it may be that in some contexts, as in corporate contexts, debt of various stages of a seniority, juniority ladder is appropriate, we believe that the contracting process has been rather unsatisfactory in the sovereign debt case, and that one of the things that the report emphasizes is that as the range of creditors increases and as the range of contractual arrangements increase, the kinds of procedures that the international community has directed at assuring that there are comparable outcomes has attenuated in their reach and efficacy and needs to be modernized and restructured.
I think, Lorenzo, hello. I think that, you know, one aspect that is essential to this question is that of transparency. Because a lot of this sort of embedded seniority in contracts obviously is something that's not known to other creditors. And this is why in the common framework, as I mentioned, there are 3 countries that have applied, and Chad is already in the process of doing it. So part of it is discovery. So, what is exactly owed to whom? And you know, as I was saying, I mean, first you have to take stock of what's going on, what's really going on, and then apply the principles of comparability, engaging Paris Club and non-Paris Club members. So this is, I mean, your question goes to the heart of, you know, what the report is recommending.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. This one is from Paul Schurd at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's asking, emerging markets, least developed countries by definition have the greatest growth potential, yet face the biggest challenges in financing their growth. Big picture, what, if anything, can be changed in the international system to start to resolve this paradox? Are we missing something?
I will, I'm very open to the idea that we are missing something, and the question is what it would be. I agree with you, Paul, that if somebody came from Mars and had studied economics but knew nothing of the arrangements of planet Earth, one of the things that they would be surprised by was that there was not a larger net flow of capital from the aging, rich, slowly growing world to the young, potentially rapidly growing, emerging market world. I think some substantial part of this has to do with the attractiveness of the investment opportunity in poor countries. Just think about relatively depressed regions of the United States. At some level, you could argue that there should be huge amounts of capital flowing to them because they have more room to grow, catching up to San Francisco or New York City. On the other hand, there are reasons why they are relatively depressed that make them perhaps a less attractive vehicle for investment. So a lot of this goes to the quality of the institutions, the quality of the educational systems, the quality of the economic environment in relatively poor places. But an important responsibility exists on the part of the public sector. One of the things our report points up, and maybe this in some different contexts could be said much more starkly, the scale of international financial intermediation by international financial institutions has not been close to keeping up with the growth of the global economy or the growth of private capital flows. And we recommend, in terms of the SDR allocation, in terms of the new facility at the IMF, in terms of the recommendations for the multilateral development banks, steps that would address that in part. It's also the case, as we know domestically, that better rule of law facilitates exchange and facilitates private financing transactions. And the absence of satisfactory institutions for working out problematic debt contributes both on the supply side and the demand side to there being less private flow of capital than there ideally would be. That's why I at least regard the last 6 recommendations directed at the debt architecture as being very, very important. Maybe this is actually a reasonable note for me to close my part of this on, say what I think the broad structure is. There is an aversion to planning for failure. Let's take a very different kind of event as an example. Ransom in the event of kidnapping. On the one hand, if a kidnapping takes place and ransom is going to be paid, you want it to take place, you want it to happen in a relatively efficient and effective way. On the other hand, no one plans for kidnapping ransom because having a well-developed kidnapping ransom policy would be to invite kidnappings. There is always the fear that planning excessively well for sovereign defaults will encourage sovereign defaults and irresponsible behavior. And that's why there is often a preference for ad hocery in this area. But past a certain point, an excessive reliance on ad hocery becomes dangerously dysfunctional. And that is the history in this area. That is why there first came to be a Paris Club. That is why there came to be bank creditor committees that were convened to deal with these problems in Latin America during the 1980s. And our report is saying that once again, we are in a situation where the balance is dangerously tipped towards failure to plan with respect to the deficiencies in the architecture. And I think we have made a variety of specific suggestions. But if one message is to be taken away, it is that the world is asking for trouble, both in terms of the constraints placed on the flow of capital to emerging markets and to the dealing with the problems that market spreads of hundreds of basis points are telling you will inevitably come at some point if it does not strengthen the existing architecture for dealing with debts that need to be treated.
Let me close my participation by obviously agreeing with what Larry just said. The other aspect that is the responsibility of emerging markets in attracting capital is obviously to strengthen their institutional framework. The risk premium embedded in lending to emerging markets has several components. One is the one that Larry was pointing out, that there is a insufficient architecture in terms things go bad. But the other part of the premium is, the setting, the domestic setting in each country. And here, obviously, the rule of law and clear rules of the games is important to attract capital. Now, given the setback that emerging markets are facing, in terms of resources going forward, it will be difficult to invest in the strengthening of the structural framework within the emerging market world without sufficient resources. There's no, and this is why the international effort to provide these resources that we recommend in our report is so important.
Thank you so much to all of you for participating today. Thanks for submitting so many excellent questions. We wish we had more time to be with you. And thank you to Dr. Summers, Dr. Ortiz, and Professor Gelpern for joining us today and for all their hard work on this report.